the absolute mujtahids within the madhab. Al-Qadi Abu Yusuf, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani for the Hanafis. Right? You had Abu Bakr al-Athram, Abu Bakr al-Marwazi, Abu Zur'a al-Razi for the Hanbalis. And you had Za'farani and Dhafar and others for the Shafi'is. And for the Malikis, they had their scholars. After that comes al-Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun, the preferential mujtahids. These are the people that go through all of the books left behind these two categories of people and simplify and make it easier for the layman to understand what the ruling is on a given matter. Because there's this massive diffusion of knowledge and books and information. And someone's got to be in charge of dealing with this. Now, you could tell that the Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun were starting to become rare. Because when the son of Ibn Daqiq al-Eid the elder met Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, who died 728 Hijri, he kissed Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah on his forehead and said, "Praise be to Allah, I thought that I had seen the last of your kind." What that meant is that the Mujtahidun al-Murajjihun were so rare. When he finally ran across Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah and some of the other people, he said, "I thought I had seen the last of your kind." So they were rare. What do these people do? As I mentioned, they go through the books and explain the different things. If anybody gives a read through Taqiyuddin Ahmad Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, his Majmu' Fatawa, with the right knowledge and they know how to do so, they will notice that when you go through all 37 volumes and read through them, there are some evidences, but he's mainly, like every other Mujtahid Murajjih, saying there are some 5 statements on this topic. And he'll give you all of the statements, everything that's said on a given topic. The Jamhur, minority positions, rare positions, everything. And then he'll tell you the preferred position is this one. He'll go through all of that. His job is to memorize all of that material and be able to tell you the preferred position is this one. So you'll find sometimes within the books of Murajjih, Mujtahids, they'll be quoting 6, 7 aqwal or statements. And then they'll sew everything together and say, the bottom line is this. So you won't find a lot of evidence in their books. That's for the Mujtahidun al-Mutlaqun, or the absolute Mujtahids themselves. That's where you find all the evidences and all the arguments. But for the Mujtahid Murajjih, you don't find a lot of proofs in their books because that's not what those books were written for. They've already memorized all those proofs and those other things. What they're doing is they're giving you, if for want of a better word, a computer readout of the end result. Because the common person is not coming to them for ilal and qiyas and istishab and amalu ahl al-Madinah. They're not coming to them for all of these under machinery pieces. Just as much as when you go to the mechanic, you're not going to the mechanic for him to say, now listen, your fuel injectors are not interacting with, and then he goes into the full explanation. You're not going to the mechanic for that. You're going to him to say, has my car passed its MOT? And if it hasn't, what's wrong with it so I can pay you and get it done? He knows all of that stuff, but he tells you, well, you've got 2 options. You've got a massive inflation in your tire. I could repair it, but there's still that weak spot in your tire. Or I could change it for a new tire. But you don't wait for him to go into the breakdown of the radial and how the inner tube workings of the tire go, and you don't wait for that. So the preferential mujtahid, he has all the machinery in front of him, but he can give you the readout on any given subject and tell you this is what the preferred position is. So the layman will often come and say, well, I've heard so many different things about where the hands go. What do I do? Preferential mujtahid, there are these different positions that you've mentioned, but the strongest is this. And that's it. Then if you ask and say, well, what about this proof and that proof? Then he says, the points that you've mentioned, this is held by this group. This position on this understanding of this evidence is held by this group. This understanding is held by this group, and this understanding is held by this group. But your understanding should be this. That's what the preferential mujtahid does. Now those people began to die out. Because if you have no one to teach, you have to have preferential mujtahids in order to teach preferential mujtahids. So the fact that they were dying out meant that the people who were dying out. It was becoming a rarefied science. And a lot of people weren't able to fully grasp what it is that these people did because they became so rare in their time. So if you look at, say, people like Taqiyuddin Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, the 11 masail that are difference of opinion aside, if you look at him, Jalaluddin al-Suyuti, those were people who had incredible tribulations in their time. Why? Because the true mujtahid is not a product of his time. The true mujtahid is not a product of his time. Here's what I mean by that. If someone is a mujtahid and deriving rulings and masail, the job of the mujtahid is going to the book and the sunnah and deriving the rulings. The Qur'an and Sunnah are timeless, are they not? They last for every era, every age. So when someone is a mujtahid, he belongs to the Qur'an's age, which is timeless. And that's why he's able to derive new masail and tell you, even though he's living, say, in the 1950s, he's able to see hundreds of years forward. For example, Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, although living in the 8th century of the Hijrah, had a vision in which he was shown a grid layout of the earth in longitudinal, latitudinal lines. And he drew out the entire globe. That map was taken and used by a few Muslim sailors, and if you look, you can see near Africa the northern tip of Antarctica. For those who might be interested to know, our Frankish colleagues did not discover Antarctica until hundreds of years later. But in just a vision, just a keshf, just a snapshot, he sees the earth spread out like a flat plane, longitudinal lines, latitudinal lines, and all the continents. And states in one of his fatwa, there are 7 continents on earth. On the other side, when it's light on one side of the earth, it's dark on the other side. There are few people living on the other side because there are still great ice sheets that are preventing more upward mobility. The continents are like, and he's going into all these explanations. The continents, if you go under them, are not empty. There's water, but the continents extend under the oceans. And they're floating on top of the rest of the dirt that goes under them. And sometimes they move and there are fissures in the earth, and going into all these details. Before the onset of geology, before the onset of paleontology, before the onset of archaeology, all these different things that now we depend on and say, well, fortunately we found this out. Because people back then, they sure were stupid. So the preferential or any type of mujtahid, a real mujtahid, he's not a product of his time. A sheikh might be. He's a product of his time. The local elder in the masjid, he's definitely a product of his time. But the mujtahid is not, because he's thinking outside of time and space. So sometimes a fatwa will come and you'll think, subhanallah. And sometimes the mujtahid will be persecuted in his time because he's outside of it. Like, for example, Imam Muwaffaq, he wasn't persecuted for it, but people thought it was bizarre. He said, it is impermissible for a woman to sell her own eggs, which are in her ovaries, because her ovaries do not belong to hers. The ulama's first response was, first of all, how do you know how many eggs? That a woman's eggs are in her ovaries. And then he says that there are a predetermined amount of eggs, and each woman is given no more than the predetermined amount in her ovaries. Do you know they started saying that in 1996? This is 900 years ago. The predetermined amount. She may not sell those. They are not for hers to sell. Nor are they allowed to make other human beings for them without the consent in which it would be her own children, because it will create issues of lineage, and it will create an environment in which monsters will be made. He's discussing the fiqh of crops. How on earth did this get in here? Because of looking forward. Mujtahids are looking forward. So in the case of the woman that gave some of her eggs to her daughter because she was infertile, her daughter has a child that she's now the grandmother and the mother to. Because really they're her eggs. That creates havoc with inheritance. Creates all types of tribulations. And the mujtahids have to sort it out when something like this happens. All these type of issues that you see, right? Last example before I move on. You had Dr. Mikhail Debaki. He comes to Muhammad Hassan al-Shinqiti and Abdullah Muhammad al-Khulaifi and says, I want to bring about a new type of surgery to help people who are suffering, to make people live longer. And it has to do with the use of the pig aorta, which is the most similar to the human aorta. They both gave tacit fatwas in support of it. Go ahead. On the condition that you will try to develop a synthetic one first. That's their position. So these two ulama, far ahead, and they had incredible criticism from other ulama. How can you use everything from the pig is haram, it's najis, it's a haram beast, it's something it's been made impermissible, all these other things. And those two mujtahids said, we agree with you. Muhammad al-Amin al-Shinqiti rahimahullah said, I agree with you. But don't you remember the fact of darura? What is the darura in Sharia? Darura is anything in which you will lose your life, a limb, or be jailed for a period of time in which you will die during that time. This is the darura. Don't you know that there are people without this who will die? Who will suffer incredibly? Therefore, my fatwa is that this was darura. It was necessity. That's mujtahids looking far ahead. Where other mujtahids may not always understand, like for example, Sheikh Muhammad Matawali Sha'rawi died with the position that it was haram to give blood and organ transplants. Both were haram. Giving blood, taking blood, organ transplant, they're haram. He's a major alim. Who on earth can dispute with Sheikh Muhammad Matawali Sha'rawi? No one. But that was his fatwa. Other ulama are looking ahead. When television came, most of the ulama gave a blanket rejection of it. But one of the sheikhs said, no, this is a device that produces signals and sounds. If we block all impermissible signals and sounds, it will become halal for us to use it for any permissible utilization that we have, for listening to recitation, seeing people reciting, or seeing beneficial lectures. But if you cannot control the venue which has been released among you, it's haram to have it. And the other scholars agreed, but at first their position was tacit. No. So you have to look at fuqaha, how, and mujtahidun, like this, when they're looking forward, the real mujtahid is not a product of his time. So they will say things that in their own time, to other mujtahids, they realize their wisdom, but they think, that's slightly bizarre, or how could that be connected with that, or why would they say that? So the mujtahid exists outside of his own time. He's not a product of his time. Right? So the mujtahidun al-murajjihun had been reigning for some time, but starting to become increasingly rare since beginning of 700 AH. It would be the late 800s, I want to mention, where mujtahidun al-murajjihun would finally die out. And it would leave you with mujtahidun al-mukharrijun. And those are the people that derive new masail, they do other things, and those people will always be around. And we'll have to discuss that later. Now we have deaths during this time. Deaths during this time include Ibn al-Naqib al-Masri, who's a major Shafi'i scholar. He is the author of the book that's been translated into English, The Reliance of the Traveler. It is that seminal text that is used today in the English language that has made so many people happy, because it was a book that went from the beginning of wudu and water all the way to the end. And in the English language, there had been no book and no one that was doing it when this book came out. I remember seeing whole families change madhabs.